All right. Hey, everybody. Nope, that's not how I want to start. So you're going to edit that part out and we're going to start over.
Or we can leave it and see what happens.
All right. Hey, everybody. Welcome to SoCo's most interesting podcast. I am Mark Ditkof, and this is our co-host, Chris Bongirno. And so, Chris, before we jump into today's episode that we recorded, I would love to hear what is one thing you found most interesting.
One of the things that I found most interesting, Mark, is that buyers are going to be in a different position than they used to be in my opinion, a very positive way. And the circumstances behind that and how that all is going to work was I learned all about that today. So that was awesome. How about you, Mark?
You know what, Chris? We're both in different locations today than we normally record, and I realized that I can match the back wall perfectly with my outfit. And your head and beard can fill up an entire camera without issue too. And so that's what I found most interesting about today's episode.
Well, and both of those things are important, Mark. So I think it's going to be a good podcast for our audience. So everybody, without further ado, here we go on to the regular podcast. Hey everybody, it's Chris Bongirno and Mark Ditkof with Southern Colorado's most interesting podcast. Welcome. Mark, how are we doing today?
Chris, today is going to be a spectacular day, so I'm very excited for this episode.
Oh, me too. This is something that we were just talking about before we started that I really need to know more about, and I'm glad we have somebody that's knowledgeable that can help us through this. What are we going to be talking about today, Mark?
You know what? It's the end of July when we're recording this, 2024, and as of a couple of weeks from now, the NAR, the National Association of Realtors settlement is going to go into place. Even though it's not officially agreed upon, they're going to go ahead and just say, we're starting the settlement proceedings, and the way our industry runs is going to change.
Who's saying that? Who's saying let's go ahead and just get started?
The entire real estate industry. And so again, the Department of Justice has not officially approved or agreed upon the NAR settlement, but NAR has gone forward and said, you know what, guys, I know we don't have official acceptance of this, but let's just do it anyway to show that we're doing everything we can from our end.
And so part of it is that they probably know enough of what would be acceptable or confident that, the vast majority of it is going to be acceptable, and they would rather just get moving down that path sooner rather than later. Is that kind of what you've been hearing or seeing?
Yeah, you know what? I think that you're probably right in saying that. And who knows with the legal system, how long is it going to take to get official approval? But is there, a handshake agreement that says, we have to schedule out, the court cases, whatever. But yes, this is approved in all essence. And so who knows what that looks like. But I think you're right, is that they feel really confident in what they've put forward, that it's going to swing the pendulum into a point where the DOJ should just back up a little bit and say, okay, yeah, we're good now. And so they just want to go ahead and get started. Now, officially, it goes into effect on August 17th. But in Colorado, we're actually changing our contracts as of August 1st. So we're even in Colorado updating everything 17 days earlier than required, but probably because on a first of a month is a heck of a lot easier to mandate versus the middle of a month.
And so, Mark, even though this settlement is with NAR, that the DOJ is, going to give their official stamp of approval on at some point, whatever that looks like, whether it's a current agreement or slight modifications. It sounds like to me each individual state then, even though it's a settlement with the National Association, each state then is modifying certain things to come in compliance with that settlement. Do I understand that correctly?
Yeah, that's exactly right. Because every state has its own version of the contracts. And so every state needs to update accordingly to match, right? Certain states were already doing some of these things, so they don't have a lot of changes to make. Other states didn't have any, there were a couple of states that didn't even have buyer agency agreements, right? And so they have to put all that into place. And it's a huge paradigm shift for states like that. State of Colorado, we've done a lot of things pretty similar. It is going to have some changes, but overall, we're not going to see anything massively different unless you choose to go in a different route. But you could do business as usual for the most part, if you're in the state of Colorado.
So what do you think the important takeaways are where we're at right now, Mark, with this really starting to impact contracts starting August 1st? So what I'm understanding with that too is that, I have a customer that went under contract this morning. That's going to keep moving forward as is. There's not going to be an addendum August 1st that modifies that contract to come in compliance. It'll be new contracts dated August 1st and after, correct?
Yeah, I think that's going to be right. And so anything that's, any listings that are currently on the market do not have to make any major changes. You're going to see some differences in the MLS itself, but they're not going to make any major changes to that listing agreement. Listing agreements moving forward are going to look a little bit different. But again, state of Colorado, you're not going to see any differences that says, whoa, we got to scrap everything and start over on all of our listings, right? A lot of it's just details. A few items that are going to be big differences based on the way we do our day-to-day jobs, right? And so if you're a buyer out there, historically, if you called up a real estate agent, you said, hey, I'd really like to see 123 Main Street. It's for sale and I'm available on this day. Can you show it to me? Many times that agent would say, yeah, let's go see it. And then at that house, they would show you the house. If you liked it, you'd go through, you'd probably schedule an appointment or right then and there potentially go through some paperwork where you would hire that agent as your buyer representative. One of the big changes they are doing moving forward is that is no longer going to be allowed. I, as a real estate agent, am not going to be allowed to show any potential buyers any homes unless they're my listings, unless they have a signed agreement with me to represent them as a buyer agent or one of those versions of agency. And so it's not going to be the opportunity where if you called me and said, hey, I'd like to see 123 Main Street for sale, instead of saying, yes, I'll meet you there at 4 o'clock, I'm going to say, great. Why don't we go ahead and meet at my office? We'll go through some paperwork. And then once that's executed, then we can go ahead and see the house. A lot of buyers are not going to feel comfortable about doing that because it's different than what we've seen previously. But don't get mad at that agent when they're telling you we need to meet first, because that's the law now, right? You cannot show houses. Now, if it's my listing, I'm representing the seller and it's a benefit to my seller to open that door and show a property to a potential buyer, even if they're not my customer, right? And so that is still going to be allowed. You're still going to be allowed to go through open houses and you're still allowed to host open houses, and not everybody walking in is going to have to sign an agreement. But if you want to do a private showing on a property, you're going to have an agency relationship with that, with the buyer and the agent. And therefore you're going to have to go through paperwork before seeing the house.
So Mark, if what I'm hearing you say, and maybe this is correct or not, and maybe it's a big issue or maybe it's not a big issue, or we don't know at this point, because I'm trying to walk through this as a potential buyer when you're describing this. And if I wasn't comfortable signing a buyer's agency agreement, then for the most part, the solution to that is just call listing agents and or open houses.
That's exactly
Is that correct?
Right. Yeah, that's exactly right.
That's kind of what's going to happen if I don't want to sign a buyer's agency agreement.
Yeah. If you want to go direct to listing agent, which there's pros and cons to that, right? You don't have representation when you're working directly with the listing agent. And so, but if that's something that you're comfortable doing, you maybe bought and sold houses before, or you're an investor, something like that, that might be a great option for you. Also, you could just wait to hope all these houses have open houses, and see a little bit of a tour that way. Otherwise, at the end of the day, you're probably going to need to hire official representation so that you can go through houses that you want to buy.
Mark, if I'm a buyer and I come to you and I say, hey, Mark, you're the listing agent on this house, I'd like to come and take a look at it. And you're like, yeah, absolutely. Let's meet at, 1 o'clock later today. And I love it. I want to write a contract. And at that point, if I decide to use you as my agent, you are then a transaction still in Colorado, a transaction broker? Or do I have how would that relationship between you and I be if you show me your listing and I haven't signed a buyer's agreement, a buyer agency agreement with anybody yet?
Yeah, so we're gonna show you all the options. One of them is what you said. I can turn into a transaction broker where I'm like a referee in between you and the seller, assuming the seller's okay with that and you as the buyer are okay with that, and neither of you get full representation. I'm just a paper pusher at that point, making sure everybody hits their deadlines and gets to the closing table, right?
And then I can also choose to sign a buyer's agreement at that point with another agent.
Yeah,
correct?
And that's what I would probably refer you.
The transaction broker relationship with you. If you took the time to show me the house and I'm like, great, but I want my own representation. And then I go out and I hire somebody else to be my buyer's agency agent. That would be something that would happen. And here's my question as it relates to these two circumstances. Part of what I understand is how much or the amount that a seller is going to agree to pay agents is going to be in the listing agreement. And so if I do work with you as a transaction broker, does that number change? And if I go and sign with a buyer's agent after you've shown me the house, do those numbers change, or are they set in stone? How does that work in those two circumstances for the buyer and for the seller?
I love that question. And so you've actually already moved on to the second point I wanted to bring up. So the first point, right, is buyers can't just go and see houses without representation. Change number 2 that's going into effect is that no longer is the buyer agent's compensation going to be posted in the MLS. So as of right now, as it stands, a listing in the MLS says very clearly, and it syndicates to the third-party websites like Zillow, exactly what the buyer agent compensation is. And so if you have a buyer's agent, they know what they're going to get paid when they get you to the closing table. That is going away. You're not allowed to post that on any MLS feeds or any websites that are linked to the MLS where they get their data sources. And so it's not going to be open information, and buyer agents are not going to know what their compensation is. But they're adding it to the purchase agreement in a new section that it's actually going to say, here's what the buyer agent is going to be compensated and who is paying for it. Is it the listing agent? Is it the seller? Or is it the buyer? And so with that new section, what your question is does that compensation change whether or not they come to me versus if they have their own agent? And the answer to that is it's negotiable, right? And so could a buyer come to me and say, I don't need you. You can represent your seller, but I know you're planning to pay the buyer agent and I want that as reduction. Sure, that's a negotiation we can have, right? They say, Mark, you're going to turn into a transaction broker, so you're not going to have the fiduciary duties for either party. Can we negotiate that rate? Sure, everything's negotiable. At the end of the day, they say, hey, I've got a buyer agent. I know your seller's only offered up front to pay X%, but I'd like you to pay my agent Y% instead. Sure, everything's negotiable, right? And that's what the new change in the contract is all about, is that there's nothing fixed anymore, right? It doesn't even matter what's in my listing agreement because the purchase agreement is going to supersede that. And so if in my listing agreement it says 1% that we're going to pay, but you bring me an offer that says a different percentage, higher, lower, or anything else, that's going to supersede, and that's going to be the agreement if executed.
And folks that aren't familiar, that maybe haven't sold a home before, maybe they've purchased but they haven't sold, typically speaking, in that previous to the settlement, it might say, your listing agreement might say that as the listing agent, you're going to get 3% of the sales price, and the seller agrees to pay the buyer's agent 2%. So it's a total of 5%. That would be something that's in the listing agreement, correct? Prior to the settlement?
It's actually not broken down in that capacity where it says this much to my brokerage and this much to the other brokerage. What it would say is that here's the total amount, and from that total amount, here's how much I'm paying the buyer's agent. And
Gotcha.
So it's not something you have to add together. It's something you actually have to subtract. And so the idea there was whether or not we bring the buyer or somebody else is, here's the total amount of compensation. If a different brokerage brings the buyer, we're going to pay that.
It would basically say 5%. And then that further, it would say that you would pay the buyer's agent 2 of the 5%. Do I understand that correctly?
In that example, yes, that's what it would show.
In that example, nothing that I'm just making up numbers here. So, and that's as far as it would go under most circumstances. It would be in the listing agreement. Buyer would never have any indication of who was getting what or where, unless it came up with a discussion with their agent in some capacity. But the buyer's really not going to see any numbers until they get to the closing table and they see the commission splits. Correct? That's previous to the settlement. That's how it kind of worked. Buyers weren't really involved in that at all.
Even at the settlement table, the buyer wouldn't know, right? Even at the settlement table, because the buyer doesn't see the seller's statement. And so the buyer typically never knew any of it, right? They would just know nobody asked for compensation, so everybody just moved forward with life, and they just went on jolly and merry, right? And so it's the seller that bore that before. And now again, it's going to be a very open, negotiable communication that it's going to change. Each contract's going to be very different now.
And so if I understand kind of the mechanics of what you're describing, there is going to be some kind of number in the listing agreement. Whatever that number is, it's a negotiation between the listing agent and the seller, and there's going to be a number there. In addition to that, and what has changed is actually on the purchase contract, there's going to be a number there of how much the buyer's agent is going to get paid and who's paying it. And that could be, it wouldn't be, but it could be, 10% of the sales price and paid by the seller. It could be 4% and paid by the buyer. Am I understanding the mechanics of that correct? That there's going to be a number on that contract, and it could be from 0 to 100. Technically it could be more than 100, I guess, right? So it's a totally negotiable number, indicates who's going to pay that number. And that's different from where we've been in the past, where it's kind of just been a seller designated number on the listing agreement, was really excluded from our purchase contracts.
Yeah, and to add on to that too, is that it's also going to be, again, more negotiable in terms of before, whatever was offered, that's kind of what buyer agents typically just took because there was no opportunity to really negotiate that. Whereas now you can negotiate whatever you think is fair compensation, again, more or less than what is upfront offered from the seller. The only reason it's really staying in the listing agreement is that if somebody calls me, I still have the right to say, this is what they're offering. Right? I can't post it on the MLS. I can't do those things. But if somebody calls me or they shoot me an email or whatever it is, as long as it's not syndicated from the MLS, I still have the right to say, yes, here's the agreement with the seller. They are upfront offering this amount. If that works, great, put it in the contract. If it doesn't work, put whatever works in the contract, right? I mean, that's why it's just totally open negotiations, which I'm a huge proponent of. I think I've never enjoyed the way it happens where you basically, the listing agent negotiated the buyer agent's pay before the house ever hit the MLS. Nowadays, it's going to be buyer agents can prove their worth and value. Buyer agents can justify their pay, and they need to negotiate that completely. Again, because it supersedes, it doesn't matter what's in the listing agreement. I can put in whatever number in that contract I think makes sense for this deal.
And Mark, if I understand this correctly, I'm just going to bring this up again hypothetically. Let's say in the purchase contract, and in this particular example, it doesn't matter what the listing agreement says. Let's say it says the buyer writes the contract, and they write it that the agent, the buyer's agent, is going to get paid 2%. And the buyer's going to pay 1% and the seller's going to pay 1%. Is that something that can happen?
Yeah. Yeah. And that's the point of it, is it's just outlining how much and who's paying it. And it doesn't have to all fall on one side. And that's the beauty of what's changing, is that the sellers don't have to bear all of the costs anymore. The buyer has chosen to have representation, which is always encouraged. I'm not saying don't go get representation, but they've chosen to go through the route of having representation, and now they can bear some of that expense if it can't be negotiated on the seller's side.
What do you think? Was there a third point that we wanted to cover? We kind of, covered the first 2 points. Are there more points that you want to cover?
Chris, there's a lot of details in the settlement that are going to make people just change a little bit of the way they have to do their business, especially, again, in other states. In Colorado, Southern Colorado area where we are, those are the two big ones that we need to drive home and make sure our typical consumers understand. Again, is the 2 points that you can't just go and see whatever house you want anymore without an agent, unless it's an open house or the listing agent. And the cooperating compensation is totally negotiable now. It is a wide open door. We have the right as listing agents now to publish listings at 0%, right? Somebody can call me and say, what are they offering? And I can say they're not offering anything. And actually, historically, I wasn't allowed to do that. They had to offer at least $1. And so now that I can say they're offering $0, but don't say that they're not actually offering $0, that just means that put it in the offer. We can review the offer, see if the net proceeds to the seller make sense. And if it does, they'll say yes. If it doesn't, we'll counter. And that's just what it is.
It's very similar, I would think, Mark, conceptually, to saying the home is listed for $300,000, and the agent would say, well, do you think they would take less? Right? The agent's not going to go, yeah, they'll take less. Sure, go ahead and write it for $250. Right? They're going to say, well, put it in the offer. It's negotiable. That's kind of the same thing here, is that the buyer's agent's going to call and say, what have they agreed to pay? And it's going to be zero. And, the person's going to say, well, will they pay 2%? I don't know. Put it in the offer, right? It's very similar to what we've been doing. It's just going to be a different component. It's not really a whole different concept. It's just a different component of the transaction. Am I kind of viewing that correctly from an agent standpoint, a buyer standpoint?
Chris, that's so right. And the better analogy, in my opinion, is it completely correlates to what we currently use as seller concessions, right? And you as a lender know seller concessions are the fees that we negotiate that the seller pays the closing costs for the buyer, right? It's a buyer cost, but we've negotiated the seller pay it. And so by default, seller concessions in a contract are zero, right? There's nothing the seller pays by default for the buyer. But if the buyer says, I can't buy the house unless you give me $5,000 in concessions, well, it's the same thing. Right? Is that now the seller just has to weigh the pros and cons of the offer. With this $5,000 hit, does it still meet the needs for me to want to sell the house? If so, great. If not, I'll counter. Agent commissions are going to be the same.
Okay. So what happens, again, thinking about it as a prospective buyer, what happens if I meet with an agent, and they say, for a buyer agreement, and they're referred to me and I feel really comfortable with them and I'm ready to move forward. And as you're doing the buyer's agency agreement, it says you're going to get paid 2.5%. The buyer's agent says, you know what, my fee's 2.5% to represent you as a buyer. And what if the buyer cannot negotiate 2.5% paid by the seller for that commission? What happens if that offer comes back as a counter and says zero to the buyer's agent?
Yeah. So just like seller concessions, right? If a buyer goes to a seller and says, I cannot buy your house unless you pay my closing costs because I'm using down payment assistance and I need $5,000, and the seller comes back and says, great, I'm not going to pay $5,000.
Uh-oh. You must have got a phone call. I can't hear you. You're back. Did you get a phone call?
I did. All right. Sorry about that. So it's just like the seller concessions, right? If the buyer needs the $5,000 to close and the seller says, absolutely not, the buyer has a couple of options. One, they can go find a different house, right? That's it. Two, can we raise the purchase price? Will it still appraise, but then ask for that compensation or that seller concession below, right? Or three, can we pay out of pocket? Can I ask a lender approved source, whether it's a family member or whatever it is, that can gift funds to cover those costs for closing? Can I go that route? So I can pay out of pocket. I can ask, negotiate further with the seller regarding the price and the concessions or the compensation, or I can just go find a different house. It's the exact same situation.
So Mark, let's say you're that referred realtor to me and you say, hey, 2.5%, and we go find the house together. We walk in, you show me the house, and we make several attempts at writing offers. And this person just is like, no, we're not paying the seller, the buyer's agent. I'm sorry, we're not paying the buyer's agent. As the buyer, can I just cancel our buyer agreement and go find somebody else? Or can I go directly to the listing agent? Like, is there any way that I get out of that? And how would you handle that if a customer came up and you were faced with that situation and the buyer said, hey, I want out. I want to buy this house, and they won't buy the house because you're, insisting on 2.5%. Can they get out of it?
Yeah, and so there's always termination clauses in every contract that we put forward. And so that's a very unique situation, right? If we really are doing all the negotiations possible, one, is this a seller you want to move forward with buying their house without representation? Because if they're already being a stickler just over this, what else are they going to try and squeeze out of you throughout the process? But if it's your dream home, everything fits well, whatever it is, that's a conversation we have directly, right? And just say, look, Mark, they're not willing to pay you. I can't afford to pay you. What's our options? And then we just lay out the options in front of you and we decide what we want to do.
And so one of those options is you might agree instead of 2.5, you would do it for 1. Right?
Again,
can you wait?
Everything's fully negotiable. Everything's negotiable. It's all situational. And so I can't say exactly what.
So even though we signed an agreement saying your compensation is 2.5, the settlement does give a buyer and a buyer's agent some negotiation after that agreement's been signed if circumstances change. Do I understand that correctly?
Yeah, no, the settlement has nothing to do with final compensation, right? They're not going to say
Okay.
you have to charge a certain amount because that's the whole purpose of the lawsuit, right? And so
Sure.
everything's always negotiable. And that's all, I'm just going to keep beating that home, right? Is that before it wasn't as negotiable. Technically it was negotiable, but people didn't understand that it was, which is why the
Right.
suit came about, right? Now it's very obviously negotiable because there's no set things up front. Everything is open-ended. And so you have the opportunity to move the pegs around wherever they need to be.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think just in terms of, and I don't know your thoughts on it, maybe you can share your thoughts on it, although I have a guess of what they'll be. I've always thought as a lender that when buyers go to look at homes, that as a country, we have the Consumer Protection Bureau, CFPB. Sorry, Consumer Finance Protection Bureau, Bureau of Protection, whatever. We protect people, against themselves. But yet someone can go look at homes and have no, protection at all. And so I've always wondered why there wasn't some sort of protection for the buyer and having that representation when they looked at homes. And so I look at this requirement that you have some kind of representation when you look at homes, again, unless it's an open house or a listing agent's listing. I think that is in a direct benefit for buyers. Would you agree with that, or do you like it more loosey goosey and they could be working with somebody and go see homes, or not be working with someone and go see homes?
So I think generically it's a good thing. I do hesitate though in regards to if I was moving to a brand new area and I called an agent and they said, hey, you can't see houses unless you sign an agreement to work with me for a year. I would be hesitant, right? I don't know because I don't know you. I want to get to know you. I want to make sure we're a good fit. I want to make sure you have my best interest at heart. Have you worked with buyers like me before? And so assuming they're the right agent for you, having representation is rarely a bad thing, right? Because it's a big deal. It's a big process. And if it gets screwed up, it can have big consequences. And so
Yeah.
having representation generically, very good. And having this forced representation, I'm okay with as long as the representation is the quality that you actually need as a consumer.
Mark, what are some, if you have any follow-up points that we need to share with our audience before we go?
It's just pay attention, ask your agent that you're going to be hiring on the listing side and the buyer side, how is this going to affect me and what changes need to make and what do I need to do as a consumer to make sure that I'm getting the information I need to make the right decisions. So if you have an agent that has no idea what's going on with these suits and they're saying literally nothing's going to change at all, that's a red flag to me. Again, as I said, a lot of things in Colorado, at least, are going to be relatively close to business as usual, but there's a few pretty major changes like we outlined today. And so there are going to be differences. If you call an agent after August 1st and say, hey, especially after August 17th, and just say, hey, show me a house, we'll sign paperwork later, and they say, yeah, let's go, that's a red flag to me because they're not doing things the way they're supposed to be doing at this point, and that could be something that's going to see a lot of issues in the future.
Mark, I don't know if the audience got anything out of our podcast today, but I did a lot. So I feel kind of spoiled because even if no one else gets anything, I got 30 minutes of great information that is really important to my job and really important to me just as a member of the community. So I really appreciate you being an expert on things like this and being able to bring it to myself and to our customers or to our audience. It really is important to get this information out there and easily to understand and practical way, and you do that. So thank you very much. And where can people find you, Mark?
Chris, you can find us on all the major social media platform at Onyx Home Group. That's Onyx with a Y. And I also want to encourage everybody like and subscribe to this podcast and put in any requests for if there's things out there that you want to hear about or want us to talk about. We listen to those, and that's why we've had some of the topics we've had. Chris, if somebody wants to reach out to you directly, where do they find you?
The best place to find me, Mark, is down in the comments below. I've got some contact information there, but on Facebook as well. You can just search for Chris Bongirno at Loan Depot, and I will be available. Mark, as always, just an amazing 30 minutes, very informative, fast-paced, and I really appreciate you, and can't wait for us to get back together again here soon.
Awesome, Chris. I appreciate it too.
All right, everybody, that's Southern Colorado's most interesting podcast for this episode. Until next time, I'm Chris Bongirno, and he's Mark Ditkof.